You are not broke because you don't make enough money, you are broke because you are unconsciously repeating a pattern that does not belong to you, and I know that sounds uncomfortable, but stay with me for a moment, because if you really listen to what I'm about to say, something inside you might finally click in a way it never has before, because have you ever noticed this strange feeling that no matter how much your life changes on the outside, something on the inside refuses to move, like you can switch jobs, move cities, meet new people, even make more money than you ever have before, but somehow, in the quiet moments, when everything slows down, the same pressure returns, the same anxiety, the same invisible weight sitting in your chest, and if you're honest with yourself, you've probably told yourself a story to make sense of it. Maybe you said, that's just life, or, that's just how things are, or even worse, maybe this is all I deserve, but what if I told you that none of that is actually true? What if I told you that you are not stuck in your life, you are stuck in a loop, and not a visible loop, not something you can point to or easily fix, but a hidden one, running quietly beneath your awareness, like a background program you never installed but somehow keeps controlling everything, because here's where it gets strange, and most people never realize this, you don't attract what you want. You repeat what you are, and if deep inside you there is a frequency of not enough, it doesn't matter how hard you work, how smart you are, or how many opportunities you chase, life will keep bending itself to match that inner pattern, so you end up earning more money, but feeling just as broke, or even worse, you make progress and then something happens, an unexpected expense, a bad decision, a sudden setback, and just like that, you're right back where you started, and it feels random. It feels unfair, it feels like bad luck, but what if it isn't random at all? What if it's precise? What if your life is not falling apart, but repeating perfectly? And I want you to really think about this, because this is where everything begins to shift. What if the reason you can't seem to break through financially has nothing to do with your strategy, your discipline, or your intelligence, but everything to do with a pattern that was written into you long before you even knew how to question it? And if that's true, then the real question is not, how do I make more money, but, why do I keep returning to the same level no matter what I do? And that question, that uncomfortable, almost unsettling question, is the doorway to something much deeper than you've ever been taught. And if you're feeling a little uneasy right now, that's a good sign, because it means something real is starting to surface. And before we go any further, welcome to the Inner Code, a place where we don't just talk about changing your life, we talk about understanding the hidden system that's been shaping it all along. And if this is the kind of truth you've been searching for, the kind that doesn't just motivate you but actually challenges you to see differently, then take a second right now and subscribe to the channel, because what we're about to uncover goes much deeper than surface level advice, and once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. And here's the part that most people miss, the part that changes everything. You are not lacking money, you are maintaining a pattern of lack, and until that pattern is seen, understood, and broken, it will continue to recreate itself in ways that feel different on the surface but are identical at the core. And the deeper question is this: if it's not your circumstances that are repeating, but something within you that keeps recreating them, then what exactly is that thing? And more importantly, how long has it been running your life without you even realizing it? And if you sit with that question just a little longer, something even more unsettling begins to emerge. Because the moment you stop looking at your life as a series of random events and start seeing it as a pattern, you begin to notice details you have ignored for years, like how every time things begin to improve, there is a subtle tension that appears inside you, almost like a quiet voice asking, how long will this last? And without realizing it, you start to pull back, you hesitate, you second guess, you make smaller decisions, safer decisions, and sometimes you even sabotage opportunities in ways that feel completely justified in the moment, but later leave you wondering what just happened. And it is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is almost invisible, but it is consistent, and consistency is never random, because what you are experiencing is not a lack of opportunity, it is a lack of internal permission. And that difference changes everything, because when you do not feel safe holding more money, your mind does not fight you directly. It redirects you subtly, it nudges you back toward what feels familiar, and what feels familiar is not always what feels good, it is what feels known. And if you grew up around instability, stress about bills, or the constant idea that money is hard to get and easy to lose, then your nervous system learned that enough is not safe. It learned that expansion comes with risk, pressure, or even loss. So even if consciously you want more, subconsciously you resist it, and that resistance does not show up as fear in a clear way, it shows up as patterns, like always finding yourself at the same income range year after year, or earning more but spending more without understanding why, or feeling a strange discomfort when you have extra money sitting in your account, as if something inside you needs to bring you back down to a level that feels normal. And here is where it gets deeper. Because this is not just about your personal experiences, this pattern often existed before you had the awareness to question it. It was modeled to you, absorbed by you, and reinforced through years of repetition, until it became something you no longer see as a pattern, but as reality itself. And that is the real trap, because once a pattern feels like reality, you stop questioning it, you adapt to it, you build your identity around it, you say things like, "I am just not good with money," or, "This is just how life is," and those statements feel harmless, but they are not. They are confirmations, they are reinforcements of the loop, and every time you repeat them, you are not describing your life, you are maintaining it. And this is why traditional advice fails so many people, because it focuses on changing actions without addressing the identity that keeps recreating the same results. You can learn new strategies, work longer hours, or push yourself harder, but if the internal pattern stays the same, the outcome will always find a way to match it. And that is why this feels so frustrating, because it creates the illusion of effort without progress, motion without direction, and hope without lasting change. But once you begin to see this clearly, not as an idea, but as something that is actually happening within you, something shifts, because now the problem is no longer out there, it is something you can observe, something you can understand, and eventually, something you can change. And that realization, as simple as it sounds, is the first crack in the loop itself. And the moment that crack appears, even if it is small, even if it feels uncertain, something inside you begins to question everything you once accepted as normal. Because if your life is not random and your struggles are not just bad luck, then the story you have been telling yourself might not be true at all. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable. Because it is much easier to believe that life is happening to you than to face the possibility that something within you is shaping it in ways you do not yet understand. But here is the strange part that most people never stop to consider. If this loop is not your identity, then what is it actually made of? What is this invisible force that can repeat itself across years, across different situations, across completely different people, and still feel exactly the same at its core? And the answer is not something mystical or distant. It is something much closer than that. It is something you have felt thousands of times without ever naming it. It is your emotional memory, not the kind you recall with your mind, but the kind your body carries, the kind that does not fade with time, the kind that quietly stores unfinished experiences and waits for the right moment to replay them. Because every time you went through something intense, something painful, something that overwhelmed you and you did not fully process it, that experience did not disappear. It was stored, not as a story, but as a sensation, as a charge, as a piece of energy that never completed its cycle. And over time, these unprocessed pieces begin to form patterns, not because they want to hurt you, but because they are trying to resolve themselves. They are trying to be seen, to be felt, to finally move through you instead of staying trapped within you. But because you were never taught how to face them directly, you learned to avoid them, to distract yourself, to push forward, to stay busy, to stay strong, and in doing that, you unintentionally kept those patterns alive. And here is where it becomes almost mechanical, almost precise in a way that feels unsettling. Because your system does not look for happiness, it looks for completion, it looks for resolution, and if something inside you remains unresolved, it will recreate situations that mirror that same emotional signature, not because you are attracting it in a magical sense, but because you are aligned with it at a deeper level. And this is why the same type of conflict keeps appearing in different forms. Why the same kind of financial stress shows up even when your circumstances change, why the same feelings return even when the context is completely different. Because the outer situation is not the source, it is the trigger, it is the surface expression of something much deeper that is still waiting to be completed. And the reason this is so difficult to see is because it does not feel like repetition, it feels like reality, it feels justified, it feels logical in the moment. And that is exactly what keeps the loop intact, because if you believe each situation is separate, you will try to solve it separately, and you will never address the common thread running beneath all of them. but once you begin to sense that thread, once you start to notice that the feeling underneath the situation is always the same, even if the details change, something shifts in your awareness, because now you are no longer reacting to isolated events, you are observing a pattern, and in that observation, you begin to separate yourself from it, not completely, not instantly, but enough to see that it is not who you are, it is something you have been carrying, something that has been running quietly in the background, and the moment you see it as a pattern instead of an identity, you create space, and that space, even if it is small, is where change becomes possible. And once you begin to see that space between you and the pattern, something even more revealing starts to surface, because you are no longer just noticing that your life repeats, you begin to see exactly how it repeats, almost like watching the same movie with different actors but the same script playing underneath, and this is where it becomes impossible to ignore, because patterns do not hide when you start paying attention. They reveal themselves in very specific ways. For example, you might notice that every relationship you enter feels different at the beginning, but eventually leads you back to the same emotional place. Maybe it is feeling unseen, or not valued, or slowly losing yourself trying to keep the other person, and even though the faces change, the ending feels familiar, almost predictable in a way that you do not want to admit, and then there is the emotional pattern itself. The quiet undercurrent that runs through your days, where even in moments that should feel good, there is a subtle tension, a low-level anxiety, a sense that something is off, like you are always waiting for something to go wrong, and you cannot fully relax into the present because part of you is already bracing for the next drop. And then there is the one that people avoid talking about, the one that feels the most personal, the most frustrating, and that is money. Because money has a way of exposing patterns in a way that nothing else does. You can work harder, learn more, push yourself further than you ever have before, and still find yourself hitting the same invisible ceiling, earning more but somehow ending up in the same place, or watching opportunities come close but never fully materialize, or feeling like every step forward is followed by 2 steps back, and over time, you begin to normalize it. You start to believe that this is just how your life works, that there is some limit you cannot cross, some level you are not meant to reach. But here is the truth that most people never say out loud: that ceiling is not out there, it is inside you. It is not imposed by the world, it is maintained by a pattern that feels so natural you mistake it for reality, and the reason it feels so real is because it has been running for so long. It has shaped your decisions, your reactions, your expectations, and even the way you interpret what happens to you. So when something does not work out, it confirms the pattern. When something goes wrong, it reinforces the belief, and without realizing it, you start participating in the loop, not because you want to stay stuck, but because it feels consistent with who you believe you are. And this is the part that can be difficult to face, because it means that the loop is not just something happening to you, it is something you are unconsciously cooperating with, and that does not mean you are to blame, it means you were never shown another way. But the moment you see it clearly, the moment you recognize that the same emotional tone is present across different areas of your life, relationships, feelings, money, choices, something begins to shift again, because now the repetition is no longer invisible, it becomes undeniable, and when something becomes undeniable, it loses its ability to hide behind confusion, and that is when you can finally stop asking why your life looks the way it does, and start asking a much more powerful question: what is the pattern within me that keeps creating this outcome over and over again? And once you begin asking that question, not from frustration but from genuine curiosity, something inside you starts to shift again, because instead of fighting the outcomes, you are finally turning toward the source. And this is where the illusion begins to break, because most people believe they are trying to escape their patterns, but the truth is much more uncomfortable than that. They are actually protecting them, and it does not feel like protection, it feels like habit, it feels like instinct, it feels like being realistic. But underneath all of that is a deeper mechanism at work, because your system is not designed to give you what is better. It is designed to keep you within what is familiar, and familiar does not mean good, it means known, and if struggle has been your baseline for long enough, then stability can feel unnatural, even threatening in a quiet way you cannot fully explain. And this is where most people get stuck without realizing it, because they think they are trying to move forward, but every time they get close to something different, something in them pulls them back, not violently, not obviously, but subtly, through hesitation, through doubt, through small choices that seem insignificant in the moment but slowly guide them back into the same outcome, and this is why effort alone does not break the loop, because the loop is not just behavioral, it is emotional, it is energetic, it is rooted in a deeper sense of identity that says, "This is who I am and this is what my life looks like," and until that identity shifts, every attempt to change your life will be filtered through the same lens, producing the same results in slightly different forms, and here is where it becomes even more revealing, because if you pay attention closely, you will notice that your reactions are often faster than your awareness. Something happens and before you can even think about it, you feel it, a contraction, a tension, a familiar emotional charge that immediately starts shaping how you respond. And in that moment, you are not choosing freely. You are replaying something that has been conditioned into your system over time, and this is why the loop feels so persistent, because it is not just in your thoughts, it is in your body, it is in the way you anticipate outcomes, the way you interpret situations, the way you unconsciously prepare for disappointment even when things are going well, and this anticipation becomes self-reinforcing. Because when you expect something to go wrong, you start behaving in ways that align with that expectation, you become more guarded, more reactive, less open, and those subtle shifts change how people respond to you, how opportunities unfold, how decisions are made, until eventually, the outcome matches the expectation, and it feels like confirmation, like proof that your belief was right all along, when in reality, it was a cycle completing itself, and this is the hidden escalation that most people never see. The loop is not static, it grows stronger over time, because every repetition reinforces the identity behind it, every confirmation deepens the belief, until it becomes so ingrained that it no longer feels like something you can change, it feels like something you have to live with, and that belief is the most limiting part of all, because the moment you accept the pattern as permanent, you stop looking for a way out, you adapt, you settle. You lower your expectations in ways that feel practical but are actually protective, and this is where people lose years of their lives without even realizing it, not because they are incapable of change, but because they never saw the mechanism clearly enough to question it, and the deeper truth is this: the loop continues not because it is stronger than you, but because it operates beneath your awareness. And anything that operates beneath awareness will continue to run until it is brought into the light, and the moment you begin to see not just the outcomes but the mechanism itself, not just what is happening but how it is happening, something begins to loosen, because now the pattern is no longer invisible, and what is no longer invisible is no longer untouchable, and as soon as you realize that what is hidden can be seen, the next question naturally rises to the surface. Not as curiosity anymore but almost as urgency: if this pattern is running beneath everything, then what exactly is it made of at its core? And this is where most people are surprised, because they expect something complex, something abstract, something beyond their reach, but the truth is much simpler and much more intimate than that. The pattern is made of stored experiences that were never fully processed, not in your thoughts, but in your body, in your nervous system, in the way your system learned to respond to life long before you had the awareness to question it, because every intense moment you have ever lived through, every time you felt overwhelmed, rejected, unsafe, or not enough, your system did not just record what happened, it recorded how it felt, and if that feeling was not fully experienced and released in the moment, it did not disappear, it stayed, not as a memory you can recall clearly, but as a charge that continues to live beneath the surface, shaping how you perceive and respond to the present. And this is where the misunderstanding happens, because most people believe that time heals everything, but time does not process what you avoid, it only distances you from it, and what is unprocessed does not fade, it waits, and it expresses itself through patterns, through repeated emotional states, through familiar reactions that feel automatic and sometimes even unavoidable. And here is the part that changes everything: these patterns are not punishments, they are unfinished processes, they are your system trying to complete something that was interrupted, something that never had the space to fully move through you, and because it was never completed, it keeps returning, not to hurt you, but to resolve itself, and that is why the same feelings show up again and again, not because you failed to move on, but because something within you is still asking to be seen, still asking to be felt without resistance. And this is why logic alone cannot break the loop, because you are not dealing with a problem that lives in your thinking mind, you are dealing with something stored in your emotional body, and until it is addressed at that level, it will continue to influence everything you do, including your relationship with money, because money is not just numbers, it is deeply tied to your sense of safety, your sense of worth, your sense of control. And if at any point in your life those feelings were associated with stress, fear, or instability, your system learned to link money with tension rather than ease, and that association does not disappear just because your circumstances change, it stays active beneath the surface, shaping your decisions in ways you do not immediately recognize, like feeling uneasy when you have more than you are used to, or subconsciously creating situations that bring you back to a level that feels more familiar, even if that level is uncomfortable, and this is why the loop can feel so precise, because it is not random, it is a reflection of what is still active within you, and the moment you begin to understand that these patterns are not enemies but signals, not obstacles but indicators of something unresolved, your entire perspective begins to shift, because now instead of trying to escape the pattern, you can start to listen to it, to understand what it is pointing toward, and in that shift, something powerful happens, because the pattern is no longer controlling you from the shadows, it is revealing itself in the light, and anything that can be revealed can eventually be transformed, and when you begin to see these patterns not as enemies but as signals, something subtle but powerful starts to happen, because instead of pushing them away, you begin to study them, and that shift alone changes the entire dynamic, because what you observe without resistance starts to lose its control over you, and this is where we need to go deeper into something most people overlook, the difference between reacting to a pattern and actually seeing it, because most of the time when a familiar feeling arises, especially around money, you do not realize it is a pattern, you think it is reality, you think, this is a real problem I need to fix. But what if the feeling itself is the pattern? What if the urgency, the pressure, the fear of not having enough is not coming from your current situation, but from something much older being activated again? And this is where awareness becomes more than just understanding, it becomes a tool, because the moment you can pause and notice what is happening inside you without immediately acting on it, you create a gap, and that gap is where the pattern begins to weaken. Because patterns rely on automatic reactions, they rely on you not questioning them, on you moving so quickly from feeling to action that you never actually see what is driving you, and this is why slowing down feels so uncomfortable at first, because you are interrupting something that has been running smoothly for years, maybe even decades, and your system does not like that. It will try to pull you back into the familiar rhythm, it will tell you to act, to fix, to control, to do something quickly so you can feel stable again. But stability built on unconscious patterns is not real stability. It is repetition, and this is where most people miss the opportunity, because they think awareness is about understanding the pattern intellectually. But it is not, it is about feeling it directly without trying to escape it, and I know that sounds simple, but it is not easy, because the moment you sit with that feeling of lack, without distraction, without trying to solve it, without trying to replace it with something positive, you begin to realize how intense it actually is, how much of your behavior has been shaped by avoiding that exact sensation, and this is the turning point, because once you can stay with it, even for a few seconds longer than you normally would, something begins to change, the intensity starts to shift, the grip begins to loosen, and you start to see that the feeling, no matter how strong it seems, is not permanent, it moves, it transforms, it passes, and in that moment, you are no longer inside the pattern, you are observing it, and that changes your position completely, because you are no longer reacting from it, you are seeing it as something separate from you, something that can be experienced without being followed. And this is where real change begins. Not when the pattern disappears, but when you stop automatically becoming it. Because the more you observe it, the less power it has to dictate your actions, and the less it dictates your actions, the more space you have to choose differently, and those small choices, repeated over time, begin to create a new direction, not forced, not rushed, but real, because it is coming from awareness instead of reaction, and this is how the loop begins to break, not all at once, not through a single realization, but through a series of moments where you see clearly enough to not repeat what you have always done, and that is something most people never experience, not because it is impossible, but because they never slow down long enough to see what has been running their life all along, and as you begin to experience those small moments where you no longer react automatically, where you can actually see the pattern instead of becoming it, something deeper starts to reveal itself. Because now you are not just observing reactions, you are starting to sense the structure. behind them, almost like discovering that your life has been following a script you never consciously wrote, and this is where a different layer of understanding opens up, one that goes beyond psychology or behavior, because what you are dealing with is not just a habit, it is a stored imprint, something that has been recorded and replayed over and over again until it feels like reality, and if you look closely, you can begin to see that every pattern has a signature, a specific emotional tone. That repeats no matter the situation, whether it is in relationships, in decisions, or in money, and that signature is not random, it is a kind of internal record, something that has been carried forward, reinforced, and layered over time, and this is where many traditions, both ancient and modern, try to describe the same idea in different ways. Some call it conditioning, some call it subconscious programming, and others describe it as a deeper memory field, a place where all your experiences, processed and unprocessed, are stored and continue to influence your perception of reality, and whether you think of it scientifically or symbolically, the effect is the same, because what is stored within you continues to shape what you experience outside of you. And this is why two people can face the same situation and have completely different outcomes, because they are not responding from the same internal record, and this is also why change feels so difficult, because you are not just changing a behavior, you are challenging something that has been recorded as truth within your system, and here is where it becomes even more interesting, because these stored patterns do not just sit quietly, they actively influence what you notice, what you focus on, and how you interpret what happens to you, almost like a filter that highlights certain possibilities while ignoring others. So if your internal record carries a pattern of lack, your attention will naturally gravitate toward evidence that confirms it, missed opportunities, unexpected expenses, limitations, and over time, that selective focus strengthens the pattern even further, creating the feeling that your experience is objective, when in reality, it is being shaped by what you are unconsciously tuned to perceive, and this is where the concept of a loop becomes much clearer, because it is not just that events repeat, it is that perception, reaction, and outcome are all aligned in a way that reinforces the same pattern again and again, and the more it repeats, the more solid it feels, until it becomes something you stop questioning entirely. But here is the shift that changes everything. Once you recognize that what you are experiencing is not fixed reality but a projection of an internal record, you begin to reclaim something you did not even realize you lost, and that is authorship, because if the pattern was learned, it can be unlearned, if it was recorded, it can be rewritten, and if it has been influencing your perception, it means your perception can change, and that does not happen by forcing a new belief on top of the old one, it happens by becoming aware of the pattern at such a deep level that it no longer operates unconsciously, and in that awareness, something begins to dissolve, because what is seen clearly can no longer hide in the same way, and what can no longer hide begins to lose its ability to control, and that is the moment where the loop, for the first time, is no longer automatic, but optional, and just when you begin to feel like you are finally gaining control over the pattern, like you can see it clearly enough to step outside of it, something even deeper begins to surface, something that shifts the entire perspective once again, because what if this pattern did not actually start with you? What if the thoughts you think, the fears you feel, even the way you relate to money and security, are not entirely yours? And I know that sounds unsettling at first, but if you look honestly at your life, there are certain reactions, certain anxieties, certain beliefs that feel older than your own experiences, almost like they were already there before you had the chance to question them, and this is where the conversation moves beyond the individual and into something much larger, because you are not just a product of your own life, you are also shaped by everything that came before you, the environment you were raised in, the emotional patterns of your parents, the unspoken beliefs that were never directly taught but constantly demonstrated, and if you grew up around stress about money, even if no one sat you down and explained it, you felt it, you absorbed it, you watched how people reacted to it, how they feared it, how they struggled with it, and over time, those reactions became familiar, and what is familiar becomes normal, and what is normal becomes invisible, and this is how patterns are passed down without anyone ever realizing it, not through words, but through energy, through behavior, through repeated emotional states that shape the way you interpret the world. And this is why you can find yourself feeling anxious about money even when there is no immediate reason, or feeling guilty when things start to go well, or even sabotaging opportunities that could take you beyond what your environment ever experienced, because part of you is still operating from an inherited baseline, a level of what feels safe, what feels acceptable, what feels like where you belong, and anything beyond that can trigger discomfort, not because it is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar, and the human system will always choose familiar over better if it has not learned how to handle the unfamiliar safely, and this is where the loop becomes even more complex, because now it is not just your own unprocessed experiences, it is layers of conditioning that have been reinforced over time, sometimes across generations, and this does not mean you are trapped by it, but it does mean that the pattern you are trying to break is not as simple as it appears on the surface, because you are not just changing your habits, you are stepping outside of something that has been normalized for a very long time, and that can feel isolating in a way you might not expect, because when you start to think differently, to act differently, to move towards something beyond what you have always known, it can create a subtle tension, a sense of not fully fitting into the old environment anymore, and that feeling alone is enough to pull many people back into the familiar loop, not because they cannot change, but because they do not want to lose their sense of belonging, and this is where the real choice begins to appear, not just the choice to change your circumstances, but the choice to step into a different version of yourself, one that is no longer defined by inherited patterns, one that is willing to feel unfamiliar in order to create something new. And that is not an easy shift, because it requires you to let go of explanations that once felt comforting, it requires you to question what you once accepted as truth, and most importantly, it requires you to take responsibility not in a way that blames you, but in a way that empowers you, because if these patterns were learned, absorbed, and repeated, then they are not fixed, they are not permanent, they are something that can be seen, understood, and eventually released. And the moment you truly grasp that, not just as an idea but as something real within your own experience, you begin to realize that the loop you have been living in is not a life sentence, it is a pattern waiting to be broken, and when you truly begin to accept that the pattern is not fixed, not permanent, and not even entirely yours, a deeper layer of understanding starts to unfold, because now the question is no longer just where it came from, but how it continues to operate so consistently in your life, and this is where everything starts to come together into a single, unified picture, because what you are experiencing is not random events, not isolated habits, and not separate emotional reactions, it is a system, a loop that is built from three interconnected parts that reinforce each other over and over again, and once you see this clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee, because the first part of this loop is perception, the way you interpret what is happening around you, and this is not objective, it is filtered through everything you have already experienced, every belief, every memory, every unresolved emotion, so when something happens, you are not seeing it as it is, you are seeing it through the lens of your internal pattern, and that lens determines what you focus on, what you ignore, and what meaning you assign to the situation, and then comes the second part, reaction, because once you interpret something in a certain way, your body responds almost instantly, before you even have time to think about it, a feeling arises, tension, fear, urgency, doubt, and that feeling begins to guide your behavior in subtle but powerful ways, shaping your decisions, your tone, your timing, and even what opportunities you are able to recognize or act on, and then comes the third part, outcome, the result that emerges from your actions, and this is where the loop completes itself, because the outcome will almost always reflect the original pattern, not because life is working against you, but because your perception and reaction have already shaped the path leading to that result, and once the outcome matches the pattern, it reinforces the belief, it confirms the story, it strengthens the identity, and the loop resets, ready to run again, and this is why it feels so convincing, because every cycle provides evidence that the pattern is true, even though it is the pattern itself creating that evidence, and this is where most people get trapped, because they try to change the outcome without understanding the system, they focus on working harder, thinking differently, or forcing new behaviors, but as long as the perception and reaction remain the same, the outcome will continue to repeat in new forms, and this is especially clear when it comes to money, because if your perception of money is tied to stress or scarcity, and your reaction to that perception is tension or fear, then your decisions will naturally reflect that state, whether it is playing too safe, overworking without direction, or making choices driven by urgency rather than clarity. And those decisions will lead to outcomes that reinforce the original belief, creating the same financial experience again and again. And the reason this system is so powerful is because it operates automatically. It does not require your awareness to function, it simply runs, cycle after cycle, shaping your life from the background. But here is the shift that changes everything. Once you see the loop as a system instead of a series of problems, you stop trying to fix individual situations and start understanding the mechanism itself. And in that understanding, you begin to realize that if you can interrupt even one part of the loop, perception, reaction, or action, the entire system begins to weaken, and that is where real transformation becomes possible, not by fighting your life, but by seeing clearly how it has been created all along. And once you begin to understand that your life is being shaped by a system rather than isolated events, something deeply personal starts to rise to the surface. Because you can no longer hide behind the idea that it is just circumstances, you begin to feel the pattern inside you in a way that is undeniable, and if you are honest, you have felt it many times before. You have felt it in the quiet moments when everything seems fine on the outside but something inside still feels unsettled. You have felt it when you achieve something you once wanted and yet the satisfaction fades faster than you expected. You have felt it when money comes in but instead of relief, there is a subtle tension. Like you are waiting for something to take it away again, and this is where it becomes emotional, not theoretical, because this is not just about understanding a system, this is about recognizing a feeling that has been following you for years, a feeling of not quite being enough, not quite being safe, not quite being allowed to fully relax into your life. And maybe you have tried to ignore it, maybe you have tried to outwork it, outrun it, or outthink it, but it keeps returning in different forms, sometimes as anxiety, sometimes as self-doubt, sometimes as that quiet voice that questions whether things will actually work out for you. And what makes it even more difficult is that on the surface, your life might look completely different from the past. You might have more opportunities, more resources, more awareness, but the internal experience still echoes something older, something deeper. And that is the moment where many people feel confused, because they start to realize that external change does not automatically create internal freedom, and that realization can feel frustrating, even discouraging, because it challenges the idea that if you just do more or achieve more, everything will finally settle. But what if that feeling you have been carrying is not a sign that something is wrong with you? What if it is actually a signal pointing you towards something that has never been fully addressed, something that has been quietly shaping your sense of self, your sense of worth, and your sense of what is possible for you? And if you follow that feeling instead of avoiding it, you begin to see that it is not random, it has a pattern, it shows up in specific moments, it gets triggered by certain situations, and most importantly, it carries a familiar tone, one that you may have felt long before your current circumstances ever existed. And this is where the emotional truth becomes clear. You are not just reacting to what is happening now, you are responding to something that has been stored within you, something that has been waiting to be acknowledged, and the reason it feels so persistent is because it has never been fully seen. It has been managed, controlled, or suppressed, but not truly understood, and until it is understood, it continues to shape your experience in ways that feel personal, even though they are patterned. And this is the turning point. Because the moment you stop seeing this feeling as a problem to fix and start seeing it as something to understand, your relationship with it begins to change, and in that change, something softens, not because the feeling disappears, but because you are no longer fighting it, you are no longer trying to prove it wrong, you are allowing it to be seen for what it is. And that shift, as subtle as it may seem, is what begins to break the emotional grip of the pattern, because what is fully seen no longer needs to keep repeating in the same way. And in that moment, you are no longer just someone trying to escape a loop, you are someone who is beginning to understand it from the inside out. And as you begin to truly understand this pattern from the inside out, not as an idea but as something you can actually feel and observe within yourself, a quiet but powerful shift starts to happen, because for the first time, you realize that you are not inside the loop in the way you once thought. You are looking at it, and that changes your role completely, because you are no longer the one being controlled by the pattern, you are the one who can see it, and that means you can begin to work with it in a different way, not by fighting it, not by trying to force yourself to be different, but by interrupting it at the exact point where it used to take over automatically. And this is where the real work begins, because understanding alone does not change the pattern, it only shows you where it lives, and once you know where it lives, you can start to meet it directly. And the first step is something that sounds simple but is often the most difficult, and that is to stay present when the pattern activates, because when that familiar feeling of lack, pressure, or not enough begins to rise, your instinct will still be to react, to fix, to escape, to do something to get rid of it as quickly as possible, but this time, instead of following that instinct, you pause, not perfectly, not for long, but just enough to notice what is happening, just enough to recognize that this is the pattern, not reality, and in that moment, even if it is only for a few seconds, you are no longer inside the loop, you are observing it. And that observation begins to weaken the automatic connection between feeling and action, and this is where a different kind of response becomes possible, not a forced positive thought, not an artificial shift, but a grounded awareness that allows you to choose how you move forward instead of being pushed by the pattern itself. And as you repeat this process, something begins to change at a deeper level, because each time you see the pattern and do not fully act from it, you are sending a new signal to your system, you are showing it that the old response is not the only option, and over time, that creates space for new reactions, new decisions, and eventually new outcomes. And this is where many people misunderstand the process, because they expect a sudden transformation, a moment where everything changes all at once, but real change does not happen like that. It happens through repetition, not the repetition of the old pattern, but the repetition of awareness, the repetition of choosing not to fully collapse into the familiar reaction, and at the same time, there is another layer to this work that goes even deeper, because it is not only about interrupting the pattern in the present, it is also about changing the relationship you have with what you have been carrying, and this is where something like Ho'oponopono becomes powerful, not as a ritual or a belief, but as a way of acknowledging and releasing what has been stored within you, because when you say I am sorry, please forgive me, thank you, I love you, you are not speaking to someone outside of you, you are speaking to the part of yourself that has been holding these patterns, these emotional imprints, these unresolved experiences, and instead of rejecting them or trying to eliminate them, you are meeting them with awareness and compassion, and that alone begins to soften their intensity, and as that intensity softens, the pattern loses its grip, and alongside that, there is the process of consciously redefining your identity, especially when it comes to money, because if you continue to see yourself as someone who struggles, someone who lacks, someone who is always trying to catch up, then no matter what actions you take, the pattern will find a way to recreate that experience. But when you begin to see yourself differently, not as a statement you repeat, but as something you embody through your awareness and your choices, something shifts at the core, because now you are no longer trying to escape the loop, you are stepping into a version of yourself that does not need it, and that shift, as gradual as it may feel, is what ultimately breaks the cycle, not by force, but by changing the foundation it was built on in the first place, and as you begin to step into that version of yourself, the one who no longer needs the loop to define your life, something profound starts to settle within you, not as excitement, not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a quiet clarity that was never there before, because for the first time, you are no longer trying to escape your life, you are starting to understand it, and that understanding changes the way you move through everything, because you no longer see your struggles as proof that something is wrong with you, you begin to see them as patterns that were waiting to be seen, and the moment you see them clearly, they begin to lose their power to define you, and this is the deeper lesson that most people spend years trying to grasp, that your life is not something that is happening to you, it is something that is being shaped through you, through your awareness, your reactions, your identity, and when you change the way you relate to those inner patterns, the outer experience begins to shift naturally, not instantly, not perfectly, but undeniably over time, and this is where the real transformation begins, not in forcing a new life, but in becoming someone who no longer unconsciously recreates the old one. And if there is one thing I want you to take from this, it is this: you do not need to fix everything at once, you do not need to become a completely different person overnight, you only need to start noticing when the familiar feeling appears, noticing when the old reaction begins to take over, noticing when you are about to repeat what you have always done, because in that moment of noticing, you have a choice, and that choice, no matter how small it seems, is where your freedom begins. And if you want to bring this into your life in a real, practical way, start simple. The next time you feel that pressure around money, that subtle fear or tension, do not immediately act on it, pause, take a breath, and ask yourself one honest question: is this coming from my present reality, or is this a pattern I have felt before? And just by Asking that, you begin to separate yourself from the loop, and from there, you can choose your next step with more awareness, whether that is making a decision, taking action, or simply allowing the feeling to pass without letting it control you, and if you repeat that process, not perfectly but consistently, you will begin to notice something changing, not just in your circumstances, but in how you experience them. And that is where real freedom starts to take shape, not as something distant, but as something you build moment by moment through awareness. And now I want to ask you something simple, something real. When was the last time you noticed yourself repeating the same pattern, especially when it comes to money or your decisions, and what did it feel like in that moment? If you feel comfortable, share your experience in the comments, because you might realize you are not alone in this. And your insight might help someone else see their own pattern more clearly. And if this perspective resonated with you, if it helped you see something you had not seen before, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because this is exactly what we are building here, a space where we go beyond surface level advice and actually explore the deeper patterns shaping our lives, and your support is what allows this kind of content to continue.